There's constant just arguments and arguments and arguments in Northern Ireland, which I'm sure if you live there are just exhausting. I think most ordinary Northern Irish people who are living in Northern Ireland, they want to talk about the health service or the traffic or their garbage collection. But there's like this constant layer of like boiling culture war that goes on. But at the end of the day, how much better is that than having an actual armed conflict going on?
Welcome to Making Peace Visible, the podcast about peace, conflict, and the media. I'm your host, Jamil Simon. Finally, there's a stop to Israel's devastating war in Gaza. This isn't the first time there's been a ceasefire in this 2-year war, but this time feels different. Arab states have applied significant pressure, and Donald Trump appears to have run out of patience with Benjamin Netanyahu. All remaining hostages have been released, and Hamas has also agreed to release the bodies of the dead hostages. Since the deal was signed on Friday, fighting has stopped, the Israeli military has begun withdrawing, and hundreds of aid trucks are crossing into Gaza from Egypt. But as my mentor, Ambassador Howard Wolpe, has said many times, just because two opponents in a war make an agreement to end the conflict, it doesn't mean either party has changed themselves or their views of each other. If the ceasefire holds, it will be the start of a long process with many complications. For instance, the agreement requires Hamas to decommission their weapons, but Hamas officials have said publicly that turning in their weapons is out of the question. Our guest for this episode is Megan K. Stack, a journalist and opinion writer for the New York Times, who's reported from several conflict zones, including Israel-Palestine and Northern Ireland. In her recent op-ed for the New York Times, she writes about the negotiations that ended the Troubles, the 3 decades of violence between Irish Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland. She makes the case for applying lessons from that peace process to Israel's negotiations with Gaza, including on the sensitive issue of disarmament. We recorded our interview with Megan on Thursday, October 9th. Megan, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Gerry Adams, who is the head of Sinn Féin, told you that the toughest negotiations are with your own side. And I believe it. Making peace requires compromising with your enemies, and there will always be people on your side who see that as a betrayal. That's why standing up for peace takes great courage and personal risk.
Absolutely. I mean, if we want to look at the Northern Ireland example, I don't think people realize how hard it was and what a difficult political process it was for Gerry Adams and for Martin McGuinness, who was the head Sinn Féin negotiator and a former IRA commander, to bring the IRA around just to a ceasefire, let alone a peace process. I'm talking about the Provisional IRA, which emerged at the very beginning of the Troubles around 1969. But the IRA as an organization is older, and there is a long history within the IRA of viewing ceasefires with the British as moments of treachery. And so there was a huge amount of distrust and a huge skepticism among a lot of the old guard. There are people who left the IRA over the ceasefire and formed kind of breakaway organizations because they really thought it was a mistake. And having to go into that kind of a crowd in an organization where people have sworn to fight until the British leave the island of Ireland and convince them that we're going to accept a deal that is short of what our stated organizational goal is because we see a way to get there through politics and we don't want to fight anymore. That is a very, very hard sell, especially among people who are already living as rebels, as members of an illegal organization. You know, these aren't people who are afraid to keep fighting. And so that process of convincing the IRA and bringing the IRA around was very difficult. Every time Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness would go and negotiate with somebody, there would be this pause where they would have to go back to the Army Council and have this whole other negotiation. And the same thing was happening on the Unionist side, opening the door to talking about political resolutions that could involve uniting Ireland, ending partition, breaking off that link between Northern Ireland and the UK, they correctly identified as extremely existentially dangerous for them. And I think this history is still going, but I think it's possible that that process may indeed end in a united Ireland and a loss of their sort of status as a province of the United Kingdom.
Then how did Jerry Adams and Ian Paisley convince their recalcitrant followers to go along with this?
Ian Paisley didn't until very far into the process. He was actually one of the Unionists who, Ian Paisley was a very fiery, hardline figure. And
I've heard speeches.
I'm sure, never, never.
Right.
He thought that sitting down with Sinn Féin, sitting down with Jerry Adams was just, so far beyond the pale, nothing that any self-respecting unionist should ever do. He came in, the deal was made. They had the Good Friday Agreement. And basically, the Good Friday Agreement opened the door to create something Northern Ireland had never had, which was a power-sharing government. In other words, a government in which the two main communities would share power and there would be sort of a guaranteed balance of interests in the governance. So they had to sit down, and that was very hard because then they're sitting down with people. If you're a nationalist, you're sitting down and looking at unionists who really have treated you very badly for decades, have discriminated against your family. I mean, I was talking to Alex Maskey, one of the very early Catholic members of the Belfast city government. I mean, it was incredible, the abuse that he described. People would spray disinfectant on him. They would stand up and blow trumpets and horns when he was trying to talk. They would yell over him so he couldn't be heard. It was really like this systematic campaign to make sure that he understood that he was not welcome, that he had no place in the Belfast City Hall, that he should not be there. Hearing about that, I thought, that's really hard. On the other side, you have unionists who are looking at Sinn Féin, who had been the political head of the IRA, many unionists would say that they don't meaningfully distinguish between Sinn Féin and the IRA. They think it's the same thing. So they're essentially, in their minds, are looking at IRA bombers sitting across from them in the Hall of Government.
That's how they saw them.
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah. I think they still see them that way. In fact, I know they still see them that way. That's still kind of a topic of discussion.
But meanwhile, fast forward to today, the First Minister of Northern Ireland is Michelle
O'Neill. Michelle O'Neill.
Yeah. Who's the daughter of a Sinn Féin.
An IRA prisoner, in fact.
Yeah.
I believe her father was interned. Maybe that's not. I think her father was interned early on in the Troubles, was an IRA prisoner. And there's also, she comes from a Republican family.
Right. So that's a long way to go.
That's a long way to go. And her deputy first minister, of course, has a lineage on exactly the other side of the violence. The point is they've crossed into this, power-sharing government period. And according to Jerry Adams, who's talked about this a lot, he and Martin McGuinness, who were in the government and working to kind of set up this government, did kind of mount a bit of like an outreach to Ian Paisley. And, you talk about people in Northern Ireland, a phrase you hear a lot is people go on a journey. That a lot of these people ended up in a place that's very different than where they began. And it's not that they, I would say, necessarily shifted their philosophies, but I think people who understood how to evolve as the situation evolved to go along with it. And I suppose there was a moment where Ian Paisley just thought, this thing that I've been trying to keep from happening all these years has happened. And I can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. We're here. We're in this other political reality. I fought as hard as I could to keep it from coming. But yes, the nationalists are in the government. Sinn Féin is in the government. I have to deal with them. He joined the government. He did start talking with Jerry Adams and Martin McGuinness. Famously became very, very, very good friends with Martin McGuinness, which is a crazy historical fact because the two of them had gone through many decades of the Troubles as probably on the two respective sides, some of the most hardline figures. It is fascinating to know how these two people came together in their sort of older years. They really seemed to bond. They really seemed to finally understand each other, and they had lived this history together in parallel, in total opposition, probably for most of their lives in mutual loathing. But somehow in the end, I guess there was a respect and I guess there was a recognition, and they didn't just work together. They had a very obvious and profound personal relationship.
Well, I can't help but think about Yitzhak Rabin, who was assassinated by a Jew from Israel's far right because he was working for peace with the Palestinians. Do you think that there are Israeli or Palestinian leaders now who have the desire for peace and that kind of courage to go up against detractors from their own side?
I think it's very difficult. When you turn to Israel and Palestine, it's at the moment very hard to see any peacemaking, real peacemaking. I mean, can they get a ceasefire deal and end this war in Gaza? Yeah, I think they absolutely can. The problem I see is on the Israeli side. I think there's a little bit of a problematic tendency in the U.S. to kind of make this all about Netanyahu. It is about Netanyahu, but I don't think we can pretend that somehow if Netanyahu leaves office, we can assume that the person who will come in behind him will be very different or will have to make different political calculations. And, those policies, I don't think they're unpopular in Israel. I think there's a lot of polling and just from, visiting there over the years, I've been there since October 7th. It is very hardline now. There is a peace movement. There's a very, embattled, kind of oppressed, minority of people who would still come out and say that they don't want to be active in Gaza, that they want to have a Palestinian state. But it's such a small group now, and they're so marginalized. I don't really see it on the Palestinian side either, but I don't think we have as much information and as much of a flow of information coming out of the Palestinian side. The PA has not been popular for quite some time, the Palestinian government, as such as it is. There's a lot of just sense that they were corrupt, that they did not really have the interests of the Palestinians at heart.
Yeah, they're more interested in self-preservation.
Yes, and as a result have been too accommodating to some of Israel's demands. I think the Palestinians do have agency, and I don't say this to undercut that or to excuse anybody, but I think it is undeniable that historically, the Israeli government has, in fact, done everything it can do, at least for the last, I would say, 20 years since I've been covering it, to ensure that there wouldn't be a credible alternative to a group like Hamas. I think if you look at somebody like Marwan Barghouti, he is very popular. He pulls a lot of different constituencies together. He's been in prison since I lived in Israel, which was more than 20 years ago. So, I think the Palestinians really don't have any support.
Getting back to, the details of the Irish agreement, one major point that you make in the column is that in Northern Ireland, the peace agreement came first. The IRA and the other paramilitary groups didn't disarm until years later. And you wrote that this is an important lesson for peacemaking. Don't push for a military solution before attaining a political settlement. Disarmament can wait. Why do you feel it was important to hold back on disarmament?
Well, there are two ideas, but they're interrelated. And I think one of them is just the absolute crux of the comparison, because I think if you look into the history of the Northern Irish situation, they really couldn't get anywhere. They tried many different secret talks and different interventions, and nothing really worked because what they were doing was seeking a military solution to what was fundamentally a political problem. No one was going to conquer the other side, and then it was going to resolve the problem. It was a question of whether partition should exist. It was a question of whether Irish unification is possible, whether people have equal rights. Similarly, and this is what makes me feel like the Israelis and the Palestinians are so far away from resolution, I fully believe to the core of my being that there will be no peace, no lasting peace in Israel and the Palestinian territories until finally they are able to cross that same bridge. And when I say they, I don't mean necessarily just the two warring parties. I think the world as well, and especially the U.S., would need to kind of come in just a completely different way to say, there is no military solution to this conflict. Unless you're actually planning on killing every single Palestinian who lives in these territories, whoever is left alive is still going to have the same overwhelming political problem, which is you have no sovereignty, you're lacking basic rights, you don't have a country that you belong to, And on top of that, you've been radicalized, no doubt, because any one of us would be radicalized from living through the last couple of years. So if you think you're just going to like somehow stuff the Palestinians back into a box in Gaza and lock it up and it's going to be okay in the long run, that's not going to happen. We will just be resetting the clock for the next eruption of violence. And we have to notice that each one of these eruptions of violence is worse than the one before. October 7th was an atrocious attack. There's no precedent for that in any of the violence that's gone on, any of the attacks on Israelis by Palestinians. That was a total escalation between those two parties. So what comes next? We have to deal with the situation. I mean, Palestinians have a right to have sovereignty, and I believe firmly this is for the parties who are actually living there to decide among themselves with help from international mediators. But they deserve either to have full rights in a unified state, just like any Israeli who's born there, or they deserve a state where they can set their own rules. But that means real statehood. It means, they have a right to defend themselves. They have a right to police themselves. They have a right to control their own borders. And people are just like, oh, no, that can't happen. Well, something has to happen because you can't just tell them they have to live as residents of, perpetual camps because of what might happen.
Or spend the rest of time in a war zone. We've spoken to peace advocates on both sides, Palestinian and Israeli. And one thing they both agree on is that there are 14 million people living in this region, and none of them are leaving. Very few of them are leaving anyway. So face it.
Realistically, I think it will be much easier to look to creating a political path than later disarming. It's very hard to demand disarmament up front, especially in a situation like this one and the one in Northern Ireland, where you're dealing with really generational violence. People cling to their weapons in these situations. Like, you bury it in your yard or you hide it in your grandma's attic because you never know when you may need to fight again. And when people have been raised that way, to go in at the front end when you still haven't resolved the fundamental cause of the fight and say, okay, well, just give us your weapons. I don't know, in a situation that is so politicized, that is a realistic path to take. And to me, I would just leave it alone for the moment and make that political deal and do something and try to push the politics, because people will disarm once they feel that they don't need to hang on to the guns anymore.
I've heard talks that they may be able to redefine disarmament, disarm certain kinds of weapons or something like that.
I mean, even now, like with the IRA weapons, it's funny. There's so much vagueness around what actually happened with the weapons. They didn't finally disarm until 2005, which is, obviously 7 years after the Good Friday Agreement was made. It was like really almost one of the last things that happened in the sort of tangible process of making peace. And even then, it wasn't like, the phrase that always gets used is that the weapons were placed beyond use. Now, there were international monitors. There were some clergy who also were allowed to watch and verify to the different communities, like, yes, this happened. But I have no idea what happened to those weapons, and no one has ever, as far as I know, explained it publicly. I don't know if they were destroyed. I don't know if they were taken out of the country. I would guess it was partly made oblique because there was a desire on the part of nationalist leadership not to kind of like make it too obvious to regular people that there were no more guns. Like the image of the guns all being, destroyed somehow, or that, I just think that would have been somehow they felt that would touch a nerve. And I think it would have, actually.
You've said in another piece that you did for the New York Times that what's required is a broad peace agreement that includes more than just Israel and Palestinians. Why do you think that's important? And what do you think that might look like?
I think that Trump, in particular, when he first reached office, I actually think it was an amazing geopolitical moment where there was an opportunity to do a broader regional deal. To some extent, I think that's still there. I think it's been weakened, especially with the bombing of Iran, Israel's bombing of Qatar. But I think Trump in some ways is uniquely suited to that kind of thing because there's that side of him that just doesn't care about precedent and doesn't care about hurting feelings or upholding diplomatic norms. And he'll just kind of go in and bust everything up. And frankly, when it comes to our Middle East policy, I don't think that would be totally unwelcome. I mean, it depends what happens afterwards, but it's like the status quo is pretty bad. I don't think any of it could be done without an Israeli-Palestinian settlement of some kind.
Right.
But if you get a deal there, I think you've opened the door to an Iran-Israel-US deal, which is badly needed. And then, of course, like Saudi Arabia is there too. I think Saudi Arabia would love to be able to normalize relations with Israel
They
without...
were on their way to doing that before the
I know.
Hamas struck,
Because I think a lot of these leaders see, I mean, it's not like they have wonderful altruistic, motivations. I think a lot of them see that there's money to be made in these big deals, and they like this sort of Kushner model and the Trump model and the golf courses and the hotels and the resorts, and that they could really do a lot if they could work across the entire region without all of these sort of no-go zones. And as far as the Arab governments have sold out the Palestinians, and I would say that they certainly have. When I lived in Cairo for years and spent all the time sort of traveling through all the Arab countries. The Arab people do care about the Palestinian cause, and they do see it as very much something that is theirs in a way that is deep and real. And so, even though the leaders may not have a very great heart for the Palestinians, the people do, and the leaders know that. And so it's a very dangerous thing for them to kind of play with that. It's one of the few, I think, things that they really feel like they can't do.
Looking at your piece from a media standpoint, to your credit, you've engaged in conversations with some of the readers who've commented on your article in the New York Times on the website. I mean, there are over 400 comments, and many are positive and thoughtful. But a criticism that several people have, which I'm sure you expected, is that the troubles in Northern Ireland and the Israeli-Palestinian are so different that lessons from one don't really apply to the other. They point out that Protestants and Catholics were all white. They all spoke English, whereas Palestinians and Israelis, have different cultures, different languages, different belief systems, and they're more deeply segregated. And Gaza's been reduced to rubble. And Hamas' stated goal is to destroy Israel. So, I mean, there are some differences, but what's your reaction to that?
Overall, I agree. And I said that in the piece. This is not like a perfect parallel. It would be silly to think that you could just like cut out the Northern Ireland peace process and impose it upon the Israelis and Palestinians, because there are so many factors that are different. With that said, I think they have more in common than people always give credit for. And certainly there are themes and there are overarching truths that I think exist in these dynamics, colonialism, insurgency, supremacy of one group over another, armed resistance, all of these things. I mean, there are certainly lessons that we can take. I sometimes feel like Northern Ireland went through years and decades of this conflict while people clung to a view of it that is actually quite similar to the view that a lot of people continue to have of Israel and the Palestinians, worn down by bloodshed, by violence, by hopelessness. People forget that there has been a conflict in Ireland for hundreds of years because of the British presence. We've had Oliver Cromwell coming through and basically the slaughter. You say that we all speak the same language. I say we as an Irish American, but that happened because there was a mass extermination of the language. It was outlawed. There were periods where it was illegal to educate Irish children, which is why they had hedge schools. It was illegal to say Catholic Mass. The Irish language was literally outlawed and squashed very deliberately, although not entirely successfully. So if you look at the foundation of Israel in 1948, if you look at Ireland, they're way down, they've had like hundreds of years of this and have come to this state. In its foundation, as like the basic dynamics of what happened, it's not as different as people would like to think. I've been watching all these old newsreels from the early years of the Troubles, and sometimes I've gasped at how similar not only the sort of scenes of military occupation of a civilian population, it's always kind of the same look. When you have soldiers marching through towns where there's families living, I mean, whether it's Iraq, whether it's Northern Ireland, but the way that it was talked about in some of these old news stories, I mean, just like, it sounds ridiculous now. There's 60 Minutes reports I was watching and, Thames TV and British TV going in and saying like, oh, this is this centuries old sectarian war. And, all these tropes about these, these people are just perpetually fighting. And this is only the newest, kind of turning it into this sort of ancient, incomprehensible battle that's been going on forever and is never going to end. And this is just the destiny of Ireland. And I found it so interesting because I feel that a lot of the way that now, if I watch some of the reports or hear people talk about the Middle East, I hear so much of the same language. And I, again, think it obscures a political problem. And if you lean into this sort of, I guess in the case of the Middle East, I'd say a little bit Orientalist and kind of oversimplified and almost like mythologized idea of this conflict, you're allowing the politics to run out the back door, when in fact the politics are where you need to start the discussion. I mean, who has rights? What are the borders? Who's got sovereignty?
I want to read a quote from your essay because it's very relevant to what you just said. You wrote that people in Northern Ireland had to work with others they considered murderers, terrorists, bigots, and accepted a settlement that was nobody's ideal. Peacetime politics is messy. Reconciliation remains elusive. Pretty much everyone I've ever spoken to in Northern Ireland, from any and every background, has one firm conviction in common. We're not going back. And that's profound, for an agreement that was so hard to arrive at because it violated so many principles of each side. But now, no one's going back. Can you see that happening in Israel-Gaza?
Honestly, I think I have more confidence in that than most people I know. I think everywhere I've traveled in the world, I just think across the board, there is a commonality to human nature. Yes, it is true. People get raised into these conflicts and people get radicalized very easily, especially when they're, people they know have suffered violence. Their families have suffered violence.
Which now includes a huge number of people.
Yeah. You feel that you want revenge. But don't forget, also a lot of Israelis have that feeling, or certainly did when I lived there, when there were suicide bombings going off all the time. It's very easy to see your own sides suffering and the attacks that your own side suffers. It's often harder to grapple with the other side. But I do think that most people do not want to kill other people. How many people who actually fought, for example, in the Troubles, who really did kill people in the Troubles for political reasons, who went on to live very quiet and even very productive peacetime lives as community workers, as politicians, as, just across the board in the society. I think people, if they get an off-ramp and if they see a way that they can live and not feel that they're being oppressed, feel that they have basically the basic rights that one would need and the ability to support their families, the vast majority of people want that.
Of course.
The vast majority. It's, most people are not psychopaths. Most people don't want to live in a war. And so I think people forget how much most people are willing to accept in that trade-off. And I think most people will accept a lot, actually. We'll let go of some of these more ephemeral or more abstract ideas because at the end of the day, everybody in the world just wants to have a house, a place they can live with their family, raise their family, send the kids to school, get a job, be
Absolutely.
able to pay for what they need. But I think we don't, we otherize people and we dehumanize them and we sort of convince ourselves that they're just this other kind of radical person, that they're fighting this war because they enjoy it. And I think that's a mistake.
The complexity that you're talking about reminds me of, especially looking at Ireland, something that an accomplished mediator, Bill Urey, likes to say is that conflicts don't end, they transform. Can you talk about how the conflict in Northern Ireland has transformed from a violent conflict to a nonviolent one?
Yeah, it's now an absolutely nightmarish culture war. All of these issues remain hard fought. There's a movement to add Irish language to the street signs. So the street signs are all in English in Belfast, and there's, of course, a very sort of popular and growing movement to continue to revitalize the Irish language. A lot of people are trying to learn Irish. It's one of the aspects of, I guess, the sort of post-Troubles, cultural flowering that you can see now on the nationalist side of things. It seems so harmless, right? You put some Irish language. Many places in the world will have multiple languages on a sign or whatever. The Unionists do not want it, but they are no longer in the majority, so they have lost the vote. I listened to a lot of sort of talk shows and things in Northern Ireland, and just the incredible argument. It's a little bit strange sometimes because you're like, but you live in Ireland. You are on the Irish island. That is the historic language. Belfast itself is an Irish word. But it's also quite serious because all of it goes back to this question of identity.
Right.
Who has a place here, who's protected, who's getting precedence. Increasingly, there's a lot of discussions about uniting Ireland, about having a referendum about whether Northern Ireland can leave the UK and join the rest of Ireland. And in the course of those debates, there was a sort of an eruption of anger because some of the politicians said that the violence was justified, that the murder during the Troubles, I think was the actual language, was justified. I think that was one politician from Sinn Féin said that. So it's like there's constant just arguments and arguments and arguments in Northern Ireland, which I'm sure if you live there are just exhausting. I think most ordinary Northern Irish people who are living in Northern Ireland, they want to talk about the health service or the traffic or their garbage collection or like all this stuff. But there's like this constant layer of like boiling culture war that goes on. But at the end of the day, how much better is that than having an actual armed conflict going on?
Exactly. Again, at the end of the day, as you pointed out, in Northern Ireland, all anybody got was a process. And nobody got what they wanted in the Good Friday Agreement. Do you think it's possible to end up with a viable process in Israel-Palestine?
Yes, definitely it's possible to end up with a process. I think in the case of Israel, I think there has to be some mechanisms for monitoring the implementation because the reality is they have had a process before. They had the Oslo peace years for a while before the Second Intifada erupted. Theoretically, in the middle of this sort of period where concessions had been made, trust was being built, and people were taking steps. So the problem is that it's funny because, when I moved there in 2002, the Intifada was in full swing, and like there was still like not a total, I think, psychological understanding that the Oslo years were over. And I would hear about it from people. I would be in the West Bank, and I would hear about it, and I would be in Israel proper and hear about it from Israelis. And it was funny to me what a total divide there was and how the two parties perceived those years, because Israelis I talked to a lot of times were very, glowing. We had this wonderful Oslo period and, we would go to, jazz club in Ramallah. We were able to go back and forth and we started to get to know the Palestinians better and it was so wonderful. And then you talk to the Palestinians and they're like, well, they increased this, like these settlements construction started exploding. I mean, it's one thing to say you're going to make peace and you're going to move toward a Palestinian state, but when you're saying that and at the same time you're literally like chipping away at the land piece by piece at a faster rate than you ever have done before, well, that doesn't really compute. So obviously the Palestinians are going to look at that and go like, this isn't real. So, that's why I say it's a long journey, but I think certainly a deal can be made. A ceasefire can be made. They can get on that road. This will happen one day. I believe that one day the right leaders will come into place and the right level of exhaustion with violence will have been reached. Somebody will push that situation, I believe, probably into a one-state solution. That's my opinion, just because it's so hard for me to imagine like any Israeli government forcibly removing all the Israeli settlers. And so at some point, there's a lot of Israelis living in the Palestinian areas. There's a lot of Arabs who are still living in Israel. But that's just my take. I know it's not as easy as that. I know there's a lot of fear. I know there's a lot of complications and confusion about it. But I do believe that one day they will get there. I don't know when it will happen.
You called your essay Northern Ireland, Gaza, and the Road to Peace. And in a way, that's what you've just been talking about. Peace doesn't begin or end with a treaty or an agreement. It takes a long time to absorb its meaning. And unfortunately, it's really hard to see a road to lasting peace in Israel for all the reasons you just cited.
But it's possible. Like, we cannot get into this mindset or allow ourselves the lazy thinking of thinking like it's just not possible. It is possible. It's not that complicated, actually. All of these sort of like easy things we say to kind of keep ourselves from having to do that work in the way like that's not even our work. That has to be resolved among the people who actually live there and have to live with the results, But can we put pressure on? Can we apply pressure? Can we push things? Absolutely. And there's no excuse for not doing it because it is just a recipe for ongoing cycles of just this carnage. And we shouldn't allow this to continue.
What's really valuable about what you wrote and what you've spoken about in other pieces is that we need to look at peace and how it happens. We have to learn from every peace agreement that we can find. We need to pay more attention to peace. If we don't pay attention to the how and the why and the what of the process, we default to violence.
I think generally we go to violence as people when we have exhausted the other possibilities. I think that, as a movement, I would say that is what happened with the people in Northern Ireland, with the nationalists, when the IRA reconstituted.
I think that's what happened in Colombia, too.
I agree. And I think I would say the Palestinians also, when the political efforts are ignored, when protests are, people open fire on their protests. If you're in a desperate situation and you can't find another way to be heard, you turn to violence. You may not like that. I may not like that. It's a fact of human history. So that's why I think these efforts are important. In the last century, there have been some amazing peacemaking efforts, really inspiring and really delicate, detailed processes. And, we can do this. This is a thing that people are able to do.
Well, that's why I think it's important to look at it. I'm very grateful that you wrote about it in the way you did.
Oh, thank you so much.
It was a real eye-opener.
Well, thank you.
You can find a link to Megan Stack's essay, Northern Ireland, Gaza, and the Road to Peace, in the show notes. If you liked what you just heard, please don't keep it to yourself. There are a few ways you can share this episode. One easy way is to take a screenshot of your podcast player on the phone and text it to a friend. Or you can copy and paste the link in the show notes. We're also on YouTube. Just tell your friend to search YouTube for Making Peace Visible. Making Peace Visible is a 501c3 nonprofit. Tax-deductible donations are always welcome and very much appreciated. Go to makingpeacevisible.org/donate. Making Peace Visible is produced by Andrew Maraskin, Faith McClure is the associate producer, and I'm Jamil Simon. Thanks for listening.